The rain was hitting the windshield with a rhythm that felt too deliberate, like fingers tapping against the glass. When I glanced at the passenger seat, the box was secure with a seatbelt, an absurd precaution I had taken instinctively. But as I turned a sharp corner onto the gravel driveway, the cardboard slid against the leather with a sound like dry skin rubbing together. I braked. The box hadn't hit the door. It had stopped abruptly in the center of the seat, defying the momentum of the turn, as if it had braced itself. I pulled the car into the garage, the silence of the engine cutting out, instantly replaced by the ticking of cooling metal. I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain muffle the world outside. I reached over to unbuckle the box. The metal tongue of the buckle was ice cold, painful to the touch, despite the heater having been on full blast for the last hour. I pulled my hand back, rubbing the numbness from my fingertips, and unlatched it with my sleeve. Carrying it into the kitchen, the weight shifted inside the box. It wasn't the tumble of a loose object. It was a slow, sliding distribution of weight, like a sleeping child adjusting in your arms. I set it down on the granite island. The silence of the house usually comforted me, but tonight the air felt pressurized, the way it does right before a fuse blows. I grabbed a utility knife. As I sliced the tape, a smell wafted up, not the musty scent of the estate sale basement where I found it, but something sharper. Ozone, the smell of an electrical fire that hadn't happened yet. I folded the flaps back. The doll lay nestled in yellowing tissue paper. It was a bisque porcelain figure, late 19th century, roughly 24 inches tall. Its craftsmanship was impeccable, but as I lifted it out, the head lolled back with a sickening, fluid looseness that shouldn't exist in a jointed doll. I caught the head in my palm to support it. The porcelain wasn't room temperature. It retained a faint, residual warmth, the kind you feel on a chair someone has just vacated. I walked it into the living room, intending to place it on the mantel for a restoration assessment later. I set it down, adjusting the heavy velvet dress. The fabric felt damp. Not wet, but clammy, like clothes left out in the mist. I stepped back to look at it. The eyes were glass, a pale, watery blue. I turned away to switch on a lamp, and a soft clack echoed behind me. I spun around. The doll was still on the mantel, but its left arm, which I had positioned at its side, was now resting across its stomach. I stared at it. Vibration? I muttered, my voice sounding too loud in the empty room. A truck on the highway miles away. Maybe. I walked over and moved the arm back to the side. The joint was stiff. It required force to move. Friction would have held it in place against any vibration. My heart did a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I went to the kitchen to pour a drink. The water from the tap ran clear, but the sound of the pipes groaning in the walls had a vocal quality to it tonight, a low, resonant hum that fluctuated in pitch. I turned the faucet off. The hum didn't stop immediately. It trailed off, like a breath being exhaled slowly. I took the glass back to the living room. The doll was facing the window now. I stopped in the doorway. I knew, with absolute certainty, I had placed it facing the center of the room. The rotation required to face the window was nearly 90 degrees. I didn't move toward it. I watched the back of the velvet dress, waiting. The stillness of the doll was aggressive. It wasn't just an inanimate object. It was holding still. I sat in the armchair on the opposite side of the room, keeping the doll in my peripheral vision. I opened a book, trying to force normality back into the evening. The pages felt loud as I turned them. 10 minutes passed. Then, from the hallway leading to the bedrooms, the floorboard settled. It wasn't a creak. It was a specific, soft compression sound of a carpet being stepped on by a bare foot. I lowered the book. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish. The house gave no answer, but the temperature in the living room plummeted. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was a sudden vacuum of heat, sucking the warmth from my skin. The hair on my arm stood up, not from fear, but from the physical static charge filling the air. I looked at the mantel. The doll was facing me again. I hadn't heard it move. I hadn't seen a blur of motion. It was just suddenly, impossibly, oriented towards me, and the eyelids, weighted mechanisms designed to close when the doll lay flat, were now lowered halfway, giving a look of drowsy, malicious intent. I stood up, my instinct screaming at me to leave the room. I walked to the mantel, grabbed the doll by its torso, and marched to the guest bedroom. The room was empty and smelled of dust. I opened the closet, shoved the doll onto the top shelf, and closed the door. I turned the latch until it clicked. I went back to the living room and turned up the thermostat. The furnace kicked on with a roar that made me jump. I poured a scotch, my hand trembling slightly as the bottle clinked against the glass. I sat down, staring at the hallway entrance. From the guest room, a sound started. It was faint, rhythmic. It sounded like a fingernail testing the density of wood. I told myself it was a mouse. I told myself it was a branch against the siding. But the rhythm was too consistent. It didn't pause. It didn't scurry. It was digging. I grabbed a heavy flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and walked down the hall. The scratching stopped the moment my foot hit the threshold of the guest room. I stood in the silence, listening to the blood rushing in my ears. I reached for the closet knob. It was cold, condensation slicking the brass. I turned it. The door swung open. The shelf was empty. I stepped back, sweeping the beam across the floor. Nothing. I checked under the bed. Dust bunnies and an old shoebox. I checked behind the curtains. I spun around, sweeping the light across the room, panic rising in my throat like bile. I backed out of the room and bumped into something soft in the hallway. I spun around, dropping the light. It clattered, the beam spinning wildly before settling on the legs of the hallway table. Sitting on the floor, right where I had just been standing moments before, was the doll. It was seated perfectly upright, legs splayed, hands resting on its knees, staring up at me. I scrambled back, my heels slipping on the hardwood, until my back hit the wall. The doll didn't move, but the shadows cast by the flashlight beam seemed to stretch toward it, pulling around the velvet dress. The smell of ozone was overpowering now, mixed with something else, wet earth. I couldn't stay in the house. I needed to get out. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl, skirting around the doll, giving it a wide berth. As I passed it, I heard a sound, a wet intake of air, a gasp, tiny, restricted, as if coming from a throat the size of a straw. I ran to the garage. I unlocked the car, threw myself into the driver's seat, and hit the lock button. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, sputtered, and died. I tried again. Just the clicking of the starter. The garage lights flickered. Once, twice, then they went out completely. I was in total darkness, save for the faint glow of the dashboard clock. I checked the rear view mirror, purely out of habit. Too small. Pale hands were gripping the headrest of the back seat. I didn't scream. My voice was paralyzed. I stared at the mirror. The hands were gray in the low light, the fingers too long, pressing into the leather. Slowly, the top of the porcelain head rose above the seat. The eyes caught the green light of the dashboard clock. They were glowing faintly from within. I fumbled for the door handle. It wouldn't open. The lock plunger was down. I pulled the manual lock. It snapped back down the instant I let go, with a force that bruised my fingers. The doll was rising higher. I could see the painted mouth now. It wasn't a smile. The mouth was slightly open, and inside, where there should have been darkness or plaster, I saw movement. Something wet and glistening was shifting inside the hollow cavity of the head. I kicked the window. The safety glass held. I kicked again, harder, my heel throbbing. The doll leaned forward, right between the front seats. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a physical wave of freezing air hitting the back of my neck. Mine, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the doll's mouth. It came from the car speakers, distinct and distorted by static. I slammed my shoulder against the door. The mechanism gave way with a screech of tearing metal, and I spilled out onto the concrete floor. I scrambled up, running for the side door of the garage. I didn't look back. I burst out into the rain. The cold water hit me like a shock. I ran to the center of the driveway, gasping for air, looking back at the house. The garage was dark. The house was dark. Then, the living room light flickered on. I saw my silhouette in the window, but I was outside. I squinted through the rain. The figure in the window was standing at the glass, looking out. It was too small to be a person. It was standing on the sill. It raised a hand, pressing against the glass. I backed away toward the road. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my wet fingers struggling with the screen. It was a text message from my own number. I opened it. It was a photo. It was a picture of me taken from the back seat of my car just seconds ago. The angle was low, looking up at the back of my head, but in the rear view mirror, visible in the photo, my own reflection wasn't looking at the road. My reflection was looking directly into the camera lens, its eyes entirely black, its mouth open in a scream that matched the doll's. I looked up at the window again. The light went out. The gravel crunched behind me. Heavy footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not a doll. Something with weight. Something massive. I turned around. The darkness of the tree line was absolute, but the smell of ozone and wet earth washed over me. So strong I tasted it. I didn't run. I couldn't. The air around me had turned solid, thick and gelatinous. I tried to lift my foot, but it felt like I was standing in setting concrete. A hand, cold and enormous, smelling of old porcelain and decay, rested on my shoulder. "You forgot me," the voice whispered, directly into my ear. And then the weight of the doll, the physical, impossible weight of it, settled onto my chest, pressing the air from my lungs as the world went black.